How are you going? Are you where you want to be financially? And if not, what's holding you back? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's show. And it's probably not at all about the type of things that you think I'm going to discuss.
Are you interested in property investing, success or money? Well, you're in the right place. This is the Michael Yardney podcast, where each week you'll learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in 20 minutes or less. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the fourth time he's won a similar award in the last 6 years.
How are you going financially? Are you where you expected to be at this stage of your life? Would you like to move further? Now, if you're like most Australians, you're probably not as far financially as you expected to be. So today's show is for you, and even if you're doing well, it's for you, because I'm going to discuss the science of behavioural finance. Now, you probably haven't even heard of this before, but it's a very, very important topic, the basis of my 12-month mentorship program, but it's the big difference between successful investors, entrepreneurs and business people and the average Australian. So welcome to this week's show, particularly to all the new listeners, and thank you so much for coming back if you're a regular listener to my show. You see, we make thousands of decisions every day. Do I cross the road now, or do I wait for the oncoming truck to pass? Should I eat fries or a salad for lunch? How much should I tip the waitress? Now, we usually make these decisions with almost no thought, using what psychologists call heuristics, rules of thumb that enable us to navigate our lives. Now, look, without these mental shortcuts, we'd be paralysed by the multiple daily choices we've got. But in certain circumstances, these shortcuts lead to predictable errors. Predictable, that is, if you know what to watch out for. For example, did you know we're naturally biased towards selling investments that are doing well for us, but holding on to those that are doing poorly? Makes no sense. But behavioural finance is the study of the dozens of financial decision-making errors that can be avoided if we're familiar with the biases that cause them. One study after another has come to the conclusion that investors often make decisions that are clearly unlikely to help them make more money or keep their wealth. As counterintuitive as this may seem, there's actually a lot of evidence to support it. So today I want to talk about these predictable errors and help you discover where you're most susceptible to them. So the aim of today's show is to guide you towards better financial decisions, to help you learn how to improve your spending, your saving, and particularly your investing. So why do we make these mistakes in our investing? Why are we irrational in our decision making? Why do we have what we call cognitive biases? Because I'm going to explain 15 of them to you in this show. You see, every cognitive bias is useful in itself. The world's a complicated place. And if we had to make a perfect decision every time we made a decision, we'd be so bogged down that we'd never do anything. So as humans, we've evolved to have these cognitive biases, these cognitive shortcuts to make better decisions that are often right in the short term. There's lots of different biases. There's a loss aversion bias. We don't like losses. Look, a prehistoric man on the African savannah may have heard a rustle in the bush. Now, it may have ended up being nothing, but that bias we've developed is that there's a potential that there's a tiger in the bush. So we over-respond and we run away to negative things, even if there could be nothing there. Now, it actually makes more sense to our brain to run away from 10 non-lions than getting it wrong and stand there and be eaten by that one lion. So these biases are useful. They're shortcuts that allow us to escape the complexities of the world. But in the modern world that we're often faced with these situations that are so far away from that escaping tiger on the African savannah. But those shortcuts that we developed years ago, that we've evolved with, now cost us something. So the first step to make better investment decisions is to become aware that we're currently making bad decisions. Merely becoming aware isn't enough to stop you making these bad decisions. When we make these bad decisions, we invariably make them in situations that are emotionally charged. So while it's easy to see how these biases make us think irrationally, as I discuss them with you, you're going to recognise that under normal conditions, they make sense. But at times of stress, at times of pressure, it's likely you're going to revert to what feels most comfortable to you. When we make decisions that are biased, what we're doing is trading off some version of the right decision for a comfortable decision today. And in the heat of the moment, the decisions we as human beings gravitate to is the ones that feel right to us, in our gut. And while they may be in the wrong direction for the long-term needs that we've got, at the moment they feel like the right decision. Now, don't get lost in what I'm saying. It's all going to make sense. So, while I'm calling these decisions irrational, maybe they're not really irrational, but they're expensive to you. That's why, as humans, we make irrational decisions, wrong decisions in our investment that you can see in others, but sometimes you can't see them in yourself, but they have a long-term cost to you. So what we're going to discuss now is 15 of, I think they've come up with 183 cognitive biases. But have fun as I go through this list with you and see how many of them apply to you. Now, when I discuss these with people in my mentorship program and I say, how much of these apply to you? Most people can't see it. But I say, well, yeah, with your friends, with your wife, with your spouse, with your husband, how many of these apply to them? And they say, oh, all the time. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? So let's see what these cognitive biases are. What's standing between you and property investing success? Let's be frank. It could be you. Look, maybe you're too biased to be a successful property investor. Now, you're probably thinking, what does Michael mean by that? Well, did you know that as property investors, we can sometimes be our own worst enemies? And it's not because of the decisions we make, the opportunities we consider, or the investments we miss out on, but rather it's due to the way we think. That's what I'm going to discuss in today's show. Now, this morning I woke up to an email that really excited me. It was, what a podcast. Hi, Michael. I'd like to thank you for putting such a great podcast series together. I find the depth of insights to be great. I do especially enjoy your insights into the mindsets and thoughts of wealthy and successful people. And he went on to say a lot of other things, but thank you so much, Chris Henry, for those lovely words. It inspired me to think, what else can I share about the way successful investors think and do things differently? So this session today is not about how to find the next hotspot or do a special deal. It's about cognitive biases, the way our brain sneakily convinces us to make decisions that aren't always in our best interests. Cognitive biases sometimes convince us to spend more, to save less, to feel more confident in our decisions than perhaps we should be. And the scary thing is, for the most part, we are powerless against them. So I hope you're going to get some benefit from this chat today, which will probably be a little bit longer session than normal because I've got a lot of things to cover. You see, I've recently read that there are 183 cognitive biases. But before you turn off the podcast and press the stop button, no, I'm not going to go through all those at all today. I'm going to cover some of the common ones. And the first one I'd like to discuss is something called confirmation bias, because people tend to search for information that confirms their view of the world, and they tend to ignore what doesn't fit. In an uncertain world, we love to be right because it helps us make sense of things. And, we do this automatically, usually without realising it, partly because it's easier to see where new pieces fit into the picture puzzle we're working on than rather imagining a new picture. For example, if we believe a particular type of property or a specific region is going to make good investing, then we only tend to seek out news and information that supports that position. Confirmation bias also prevents us from looking objectively at an investment we've already made. Once we've bought a property, we tend to look for information that confirms that we've already made a good decision, while at the same time ignoring information that may indicate the investment may be a questionable one. So what can you take away from this? One way to counter confirmation bias is to read things you're going to disagree with. In other words, read all you can, but from reputable sources, whether it's confirming your original view or not. Another is to look for reasons your strategy could be wrong rather than right. Unfortunately, I see this all the time in comments I get on my property update blog or in Facebook where people keep telling me that where they think they should invest is the right way and where I think and our research shows is the wrong way. Confirmation bias puts a stop to many property investors' plans to become successful. Another bias you're probably not aware of is something called anchoring bias. We have a tendency to use anchors or reference points to make decisions and evaluations, but sometimes these lead us astray. Anchoring explains why you're prepared to pay $6 an hour for a car space in the middle of town after seeing a $10 a car park sign down the street. The first number you see, especially when it's price, the first number that comes up in negotiations colours anything that comes after it. Now, of course, property marketers, estate agents, car salespeople know how to use this principle all the time. They start with a high asking price, and then you suddenly feel good when you've extracted a discount from them. This is because the initial price you set for a house or a car or whatever you did, or any kind of deal, tends to have ramifications right through the process coming to an agreement. Whether we like it or not, our mind keeps referring back to that initial number. So as an investor, what can you do about this? As you can see, it's natural for our brain to select an anchor as a shortcut. That's the way it helps make its decisions. So it's important for you to evaluate any property deal based on its own fundamentals and on all the information that you've got available from your research and from your due diligence at the time. Another bias I'd like to talk about is awareness bias. How are your investments performing? Are you happy with the results? There's a chance that even if they're not doing well, you may not even recognise it. In fact, it's been shown that the poorest performers in all areas of life are the least aware of their own incompetence. Lacking the capacity to realise how badly at a task you do things is known as the Dunninger-Kruger effect. Look, you've probably noticed this amongst people at work, that some of the people who are the worst performers don't even realise it. Maybe that's nature's way of being kind to them. But as a smart investor, you've got to recognise that if you're the smartest person in your team, you're in trouble. It's best to work with mentors and professional advisors. As a property investor, you should consider getting the independent team of Metropole on your side, not only to help you formulate a property strategy that's proven and stood the test of time, but also to help you annually review the performance of your property portfolio objectively. Because I tend to find when people review their own property's performance, they're looking too subjectively, too emotionally. So that's the concept of awareness bias. The next one I'd like to talk about is positivity bias, because many people view residential real estate positively, considering it an asset class through which they can grow their wealth. And they continue to view it in this light, even if their investment fails to prosper. In the face of lack of capital growth or prolonged vacancies or inflated expenses, they still continue to believe that their investment is going to turn the corner one day. The problem with this is that when all signs point to a dud investment, it's likely that you've got one. But positivity bias can stand in your way. It stops you taking action. It stops you taking action to rectify the situation. So overconfidence is a real risk to property investors. And one of the best things you can do as an investor is to admit it. Admit what you don't know and get a good team of professionals around you who are objective and can help you. Another bias, maybe the opposite, is what I'd call negativity bias. So just as some investors are overly positive, negativity bias is the tendency to put more emphasis on negative experiences rather than positive ones. People with this bias feel that the bad is stronger than the good and will perceive threats more than opportunities in a given situation. Now, psychologists would argue that this is an evolutionary adaptation. It's better to mistake a rock for a bear than a bear for a rock. To keep our ancestors alive, Mother Nature evolved a brain that routinely tricked them into making 3 mistakes. Number 1, overestimating threats. Number 2, underestimating opportunities. And number 3, underestimating resources, for dealing with threats and fulfilling opportunities. Now, this is a great way to pass on genes, but it's a lousy way to promote quality of life or grow your wealth through property. So, as an investor, you've got to recognise the fact that you're always going to find property pessimists around telling you why not to invest and reminding you of all the things that can go wrong, as you've got to minimise your risks and maximise your upside by educating yourself, by becoming financially fluent, by following a proven strategy that stood the test of time through the ups and downs of the cycle, and by getting a good team around you. Let's discuss another bias, which I'd like to call status quo bias. This describes the tendency to stick with what we know, whether or not it's the best course of action. It could be as simple as buying the same brand groceries that you always have, or as complex as holding on to an underperforming property. People do this partly because they want to avoid costs, even when it's apparent that these costs will be offset by a larger gain down the track. But that's a longer term thing. Psychologists call this loss aversion, and it explains why so many Australians are willing to stick their money in a plain old bank account earning minimal interest rather than the perceived risk of property investment. Now, we like to think the fact that everyone's into property because that's what we do, but the majority of Australians never buy a property investment. So most property investment decisions have an alternative, one being to maintain the status quo, to do nothing. What are you doing? Psychologists have shown that most of us disproportionately stick with the status quo because doing nothing is within the power of all men. We often tend to weigh potential losses from switching as being worse than the status quo. So we forego those potential gains for putting up with what we've got. But that's also why all successful investors, successful business people, entrepreneurs, all the ones I know, the people I've mentored in my mentorship program, they all have coaches, they all have mastermind groups. And that allows them to see their blind spots and it encourages them to keep moving forward. Okay, here's another bias, which I call survivorship bias. It's the misconception that you should focus on the successful if you want to become successful, while the truth is, when failure becomes invisible, the difference between failure and success also become invisible. You see, if all you're looking at is other people's successes, you could be missing out on some really important lessons for getting ahead from those who got it wrong. So my suggestion is, if you spend your time only learning from survivors, buying books about successful people, reading property investment success stories, your knowledge of the world is going to be strongly biased and enormously incomplete. The trick when looking for advice is not only to learn what to do, but also to look for what not to do. Here's another great bias that I call bandwagon bias. It's the psychological phenomenon whereby people do something primarily because other people are doing it. You know what I'm on about. This is the tendency to align your beliefs and behaviours with a group. It's called the herd mentality. Herding is a phenomenon by which animals and humans stick together as a mechanism to enhance our safety. The bandwagon effect has got wide implications because it's commonly seen during the strong property markets, when the media is making all the fuss, when you're getting this frenzy and this fear of missing out. It's one of the things that leads to property booms and bubbles. But when it comes to financial matters, we know the herd's usually wrong, that most property investors never build a substantial asset base. I've seen so many investment fads and fashions come and go. Look, over the years there was United States, property buying in the United States, buying New Zealand property, timeshare, mining, towns, vendor finance, looking for the next hotspot. And I've seen so many investors caught up in the hype with the mistaken belief that if others are doing it, it must be a good investment. But as it turned out, the herd was wrong. So as an investor, it's important to remember that just because everyone else is doing it, that doesn't mean you should follow the crowd. In fact, smart investors tend to invest countercyclically. I've often found that the herd's wrong, or if not, they're late. Unfortunately, excellence is the exception rather than the rule. And that's why I believe we should aspire to be unique and not part of the herd. As Warren Buffett said, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. Okay, we're moving through the biases that stop us becoming successful investors, these subconscious protective mechanisms that nature's put in the way to help us survive in the real world, but it messes up as an investor. And another one is restraint bias. And this follows on from bandwagon bias because it's the tendency for people to overestimate their ability to control impulsive behaviour. Will you have that extra chocolate when you're watching your weight? Will you spend that extra hour on the internet when you've got more important things to do? Our lives are full of temptations, and some of us are better at resisting them than others. Psychologists say that the very people who think they're the most restrained are interestingly the most likely to be impulsive. I've seen property investors plan to hold on during those flat few years that occurs every property cycle, knowing real estate's a long-term investment. They may even have created a strategy or discussed a plan of attack to help guide their decisions under various circumstances. But you know what happens when that time arrives? Panic kicks in and they react just like so many others. And they sell up near the bottom, just before the cycle turns. So what can you learn from this? Again, it's what I said a while ago. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in trouble. It's best to work with mentors and professional advisors. As a property investor, you should actually consider getting some good people around you to help you so that you don't make these emotional decisions. Have a property strategist look after you. See your blind spots protect you. Like maybe protecting you from the next bias, which I call the ostrich effect. You know what the ostriches do when they're scared? They supposedly bury their head in the sand, stay ignorant of the approaching threat. Actually, not even sure if that's real, but that's what the cartoons say, isn't it? Anyway, this lack of logic presumably says, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. Silly? Sure. Maybe it isn't that ridiculous as it sounds, because humans do it too. While we simply don't have the neck length to literally stick our heads in the sands, people often deliberately look away from their money problems. So your lesson from knowing about this bias now is that some investors avoid unpleasant information, such as reading negative financial news or checking on the performance of their properties. And many Australians bury their head in the sand about their future financial security. They put off investing altogether. They just think, it's all going to work out okay. On the other hand, successful investors read as much as they can, talk to others who've got different perspectives, surround themselves with positive, supportive people who can help them form an objective view of what's going on. We're going through this list of biases, and I hope you're getting some great information out of this, because it's what I've seen as I've mentored well over 2,000 people hold a lot of very intelligent people back. This has nothing to do with how smart you are. This has nothing to do what your level of education is. These are things that all of us as humans do, including choice supportive bias. Here's where you prefer the things you own, even if they've got flaws, over things you don't own, because you made a rational choice when you bought them, so you got to follow through. For example, if you buy a computer running Windows instead of one with Apple's, you're much more likely to downplay the fault of Windows while amplifying all those issues that Apple have got. It's the same with Samsung and Android phones compared to iPhones. It's just like when you're convinced the investment you've made is great because you spent so much time and money and research and emotion in selecting it. In fact, you rationalise your past choices to preserve your sense of self. So what you've got to recognise is that maybe you're not necessarily wrong, but it's a bias that you should be aware of in the future when you review your property portfolio. Oh, by the way, you are annually reviewing it, aren't you? Now, the last one I want to quickly talk about before we have a quick break is bias. Failing to recognise your cognitive biases, because that's a bias in itself. Arguably, it's the most damaging bias because having blind spots means you're less likely to recognise any of these psychological influences in yourself. When you think you're more objective than you really are, you may be at risk of having bias. So the reality is that everyone comes into investing with their own predispositions, and we're all prone to errors in judgment. Of course, the sooner you realise and acknowledge these tendencies in yourself, the more open you're going to be about improving and making better investment decisions. Simply becoming aware of these biases mean half the battle is already won. It also will help you understand that you're your own worst enemy. Now, we all want to think that we're rational. We all want to think these biases afflict other people and not us. However, I'm trying to get across the message that our brains are designed with blind spots. And one of their clever tricks is to confer on us the comforting delusion that we don't have any biases. This is why so many of us not only make bad decisions with money, but make the same mistakes over and over again. We're blinded to our blindness. Now, we're going to have a short break, and when I come back, I'm going to go through some other biases. I hope you find this useful. It's a slightly longer session than normal, and it's not specifically about property, but what I'm trying to show you is that you're biased. And if you don't think you're biased, you've got bias.
Are you wondering who you can turn to for independent and unbiased advice? Metropole has helped beginning investors buy their first property, experienced investors add to their portfolio, and sophisticated investors manufacture capital growth by becoming property investors. The team at Metropole Property Strategists have been involved in over $2 billion worth of property transactions, creating wealth for their clients, and they can do the same for you. It's a great feeling having the independent team at Metropole helping you formulate and implement your wealth-building property investment strategy. Arrange a time for an obligation-free chat at metropole.com.au.
Well, welcome to the second half of the show. A moment ago, I started to explain to you that we like to think we're rational human beings. However, I also shared with you the concept that we're in fact prone to a group of cognitive biases that cause us to think and to act irrationally, and that these affect many of our investment decisions. Even thinking we're rational, despite evidence of irrationality in others, is known as blind spot bias. So in this second half of the show, I want to examine some further ways our brain sneakily convinces us to make decisions that aren't always in our best interest. One of the things we should probably talk about is this concept of clustering illusion. This is a tendency to see patterns in random events. Now, this is particularly true of gamblers who desperately try to beat the system by seeing patterns in events such as cards or the roulette wheel. Our minds are sort of pattern machines, and we recognise people and things from their overall pattern rather than from the full detail. Now, while this is very useful, it also means we tend to see patterns where there aren't any. This is selective thinking, and it can lead to the wrong conclusions, especially when faced with multiple mixed messages like we are in the market at the moment, especially with all those mixed messages in the property market. So just be aware that sometimes we don't think rationally. Another bias is what I call the curse of knowledge. And you suffer from the curse of knowledge when you know things that other people don't know, and you've forgotten what it's like not to know this knowledge. Now, I actually don't watch it. It's sometimes on in the background on TV at home, The Big Bang Theory. But I believe it's difficult for that scientist Sheldon Cooper to understand his waitress neighbour Penny. Now, I see this in relation to property investment when I come across professionals who are successful in their own fields, whether they're doctors or dentists or lawyers, and then believe they can translate this success into other areas like real estate. So what I'd like to teach you from this is that highly intelligent people often have difficulty asking for help or taking advice because they think they should be able to work things out for themselves. So they try and tweak and improve and fine-tune someone else's property investment strategy, interpreting it with their own biases, and they wonder why it doesn't work for themselves. On the other hand, I found many successful investors are dumb. They just find a strategy that works well for their mentors and they follow it implicitly. Now, I see this all the time. I've had people come across us at Metropole who say, I've been to Michael's seminars, I've read his books and I'm following his advice, and it hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked because they've taken the bits that they've wanted to take and not the other bits and left bits out, and then, no, it doesn't work. And on the other hand, some of my most successful clients are dumb. They say, hey, there's a multi-millionaire who's educated more successful investors than anyone else in Australia. I'll just listen to what he says. Now, another form of bias is overconfidence. Now, this is the downfall of many investors. In fact, one of the worst things that can happen to an investor is get it right the first time they buy a property. Now, this has happened to a lot of people over the last couple of years who bought in Sydney or Melbourne in particular during the property boom because they tend to think they're smarter than they are. They were carried away by a boom not because of their smart investment decisions. By the way, that's exactly what happened to me when I started off. So I'm subject to these biases as well. Unfortunately, many of these investors I was talking about a moment ago are now finding out they weren't as clever as they thought they were, as the value of their secondary properties kept falling. Much the same happened during the mining boom, where they thought they were so smart and, their strategy's better than mine of buying in blue chip areas, but all of a sudden they're left with dud properties. So I guess what I'm trying to explain to you is that there are a number of personal preconceptions that can influence our success as an investor. They cause us to interpret information incorrectly, and therefore they make you make less informed investment decisions. But the best defense against this is to continually ask questions and be skeptical of your preconceptions so you can be in the best position to enjoy strong profits from property both now and the future. Another psychological trick the mind plays on us is procrastination. This is deciding to act in favour of the present moment rather than investing in the future. Look, we all procrastinate at times, but in the arena of property investment, those who sat on the sidelines over the last few years, waiting for the investment horizon to become clearer, missed out on some fantastic opportunities, didn't they? Okay, here's one. It's a little bit hard to say. It's called hyperbolic discounting. This is the tendency that some people have to prefer smaller payoffs now over larger payoffs later, leading one to disregard the future when it requires sacrifices in the present. We all fall into this at times. Eat, drink and be merry because tomorrow you die. That's because the consequences that are likely to occur at a later time, good or bad, tend to have a lot less bearing on your choices today. Look, you've heard me say it before, that one of the traits of all successful investors, entrepreneurs, business people I see is that concept of delayed gratification. I guess that's one of the reasons Warren Buffett said wealth is the transfer of money from the impatient to the patient. Okay, here's another bias, hindsight bias. It's the tendency for people to overestimate their ability to have predicted an outcome that couldn't possibly have been predicted. The problem is that too often we actually didn't know it all along. We only feel as though we did. Ultimately, hindsight bias matters because it gets in the way of you learning from your experiences, because if you feel like you knew it all along, it means you won't stop to examine why something really happened. Hindsight bias can also make us overconfident. So it's important to learn from our mistakes and from our missed opportunities so that you become a better investor. Another bias is the illusion of control. This is the tendency for human beings to believe that they can control, or at least influence, outcomes that they demonstrably have no influence over. One simple form of this fallacy is at casinos. You roll the dice at craps. It's been shown that people tend to throw harder for higher numbers and softer for lower numbers. It makes no sense, does it? In property, it's the concept to think that you've got all your risks covered. In my mind, risks what's left after you've thought of all the things that can go wrong. Another bias is information bias. This is the tendency to seek information when it doesn't really affect action. More information isn't always better. Indeed, with less information, people can often make more accurate assessments because too much can lead to analysis paralysis. I've spoken about this before. Successful investors take action knowing that they don't know everything yet, but that they know enough to get started and they're prepared to learn the rest along the way. Post-purchase rationalisation is another concept we should quickly speak about. Now, we all do this in one form or another at various points in our life. We buy something. It's not up to the standard we expected, but we want to believe we didn't waste our resources, so we rationalise our purchase. This happens more often with impulse purchases than with carefully planned investment decisions. Yet many investors get carried away and buy one of the first properties they see, or get excited at a seminar and sign up for a property at the back of the room when they should have known better. We're getting near the end of this list of biases, but let me share a couple more with you, and one is called skills bias. You see, it's a scary place to be when the knowledge you accumulate outweighs your experience. And the worst part is, most people don't even realise when this happens. There's so much information and education available to investors that many people feel they're qualified to make significant investment, significant financial decisions, despite the fact that they've actually got no real experience to back them up. Knowledge isn't experience. You can get a lot of knowledge from the internet. Experience comes from having done things. So I tend to see novice property investors, and even some investors who are moderately experienced and have had a bit of success, but feel that they're infallible. They become overconfident. And this can lead to unfortunate short-sighted decisions, which end up being very costly for them if their property investments fail to perform. The second last bias I'd like to share with you is personal history bias, because depending upon what your experiences have been in life, your viewpoints going to influence your attitude towards investing. Research shows that the way you feel about a topic is generally pervasive and most likely shaped by the experiences that you had when you were young. Someone who grew up in the Great Depression, for instance, would have a much different attitude towards money and investing than somebody who grew up in a family who experienced financial prosperity. These influences are going to show up in the risks you're willing to take and the sort of investments that are going to appeal to you. Now, I just want to finish off today's show with repeating one of the biases I mentioned in the first half. And it's that concept of bias. This is probably the most important bias of all of them. The belief that you're less biased than you really are. If you've listened through all this show without realizing that I'm talking to you, you're probably suffering from bias. Well, that's it for another show. It was a bit different this time and a bit heavier, but the science of behavioural finance has shown why some investors are so much more successful than others. So why not take the time to listen to it once more? And if you enjoyed it, I'd like you to leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to this. Why not go to michaelyardneypodcast.com/review? And I'm going to read it out if you do. Like a couple of reviews I recently received. One from Mitch, who says, "Outstanding. Love the informative podcast. Keep up the great work." Thank you, Mitch. I intend to. And another one from Stepping Stones, who says, "I love the podcast, empowering every listener with mindset moments." Well, boy, you're going to enjoy this one, Stepping Stones, because there was a lot of mindset moments. I remember a couple of months ago, I recently did a series of seminars around Australia, and I was so pleased with all the people who came up and said, "Thank you for putting on the podcast." What that's done is encourage me to keep bringing on some extra special guests and giving you some of these ideas that you're just not going to hear elsewhere, but that I hope is going to bring you closer to the financial freedom you want, to success that you want, and to becoming a better property investor. I look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property advice. If you got value from listening to this podcast, please leave us a review and we'll read it out on a future show. Just go to michaelyardneypodcast.com/review and it will take you over to iTunes, where you can enter a review and let us know what you think. We'd really appreciate it. If you don't already subscribe on iTunes or on your Android phone, you'll find us there as Michael Yardney Podcast. If you'd like to gain instant access to the show notes or a transcript of the show, head across to michaelyardneypodcast.com. Watch out for our show next week. You'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 20 minutes.